The subject of this week's podcast is routine correspondence. And I usually put a correspondence project early in the semester because correspondence was a big part of my first job right after college. One of my tasks, well, my main task really, was to write things on behalf of the head of the department. So every day, a folder containing letters, notes, and news clippings arrived on my desk. Sometimes they had sticky notes, directions attached, but usually they were just on their own. If I had questions, I would go to my boss's administrative assistant, get her to squeeze me into his schedule, and then I'd go through the documents and ask how he wanted me to respond. Then I'd head back to my cubicle and write. At the end of the day, I would drop the folder off at the assistant's desk with the original document paper-clipped behind the letter that I had written. The next morning, the folder would be back on my desk, and there'd be one of these 3 responses on each of the documents that I had written. The best that I could hope for would have been, okay, PJ, PJ being his initials, and that meant that he liked what I had written, and I could print it on letterhead, address an envelope, and then leave it for him to sign and mail. The second response that I would get, and this one was far more common, would have been, fix this, and it would have had some sort of concrete correction or suggestion for the revision. And then the one that I dreaded was simply, no. If I got a no on a letter, then I'd have to find time to talk with him again and figure out exactly what he wanted me to say. My goal was to empty that folder as soon as I could every day so that I could get to work on projects that were more interesting, more fun. But I needed to earn that okay mark from him. So that's the basis of the grading system that I'm using this semester. I've talked with friends and I found out that my experience with PJ was pretty typical. So there's a good chance that you'll experience it too. Let's practice now while the stakes are low, because the last thing you want is the head of the department walking into the cube farm to make fun of you and the way that you botched a response to a letter, and I speak from experience on that. The funny thing is, I took a business communication course myself in my undergraduate program, and I remember nothing about it except writing a resume. In fact, I had forgotten that I had even taken a business communication class until I was going through my bookshelves a few years ago and found the textbook. So my ego here is pretty small. I figure that writing resumes is probably going to be the one thing that you really remember from this course, but I'm hoping that at least you're going to get some practice with other forms of documents, and that those bits of practice return to you, even subconsciously, when you start writing at work. So remember that correspondence is really just a conversation between 2 parties. Sometimes there are going to be other people copied on the correspondence, and sometimes they'll weigh in, but no matter who you're writing to, or whether you're writing a letter, a memo, or an email, the 5 steps for successful writing are important. You want to, first of all, prepare to write. Make sure that you have the authority to handle the correspondence, that you have all of the information you need, that you understand the situation that you're responding to, and that you have the physical materials like pen and paper, or letterhead, or computer, whatever it might be, to compose your response. Then you want to research the situation. Read the letter carefully, make sure that you understand what's going on, find out what your alternatives might be, what caused the situation to happen, and find out exactly what you can and cannot do as you write the correspondence. You want to organize the information, and depending upon the response that you're going to give or the purpose of your correspondence, you'll generally format it in one of 2 ways. The direct pattern of organization is probably pretty familiar to you because you start with a greeting and then move straight into the main idea. Then you explain how you came about that main idea, and you end with a goodwill close. It's very American. We use it for good news, neutral messages, inquiries, and adjustments. The indirect pattern switches the middle parts around. It starts with a buffer that establishes the situation, kind of softens the person up, presents the explanation for the decision or for the bad news or whatever it might be, and then presents the main idea. The idea behind the indirect pattern, which is quite similar to a general to specific organization, the idea is if you explain things up front before getting to the bad news, then they're more likely to understand why you're giving them the bad news, and you've maybe found some common ground with the other party. The indirect pattern is also useful for international correspondence because a lot of other cultures don't like that abrupt American style of directness. They actually find us quite rude. So when you're writing to people in other cultures, you really can't go wrong with the indirect pattern, at least as you're forming the relationship. Once you've gathered the information, you've figured out what you can do about it, you've figured out what pattern you need to use to organize the information, then it's time to sit down and write. Put the information into the document, clean it up, revise it a few times for yourself, and if the situation is complicated or contentious, make sure you get a second opinion on what you should be writing. Take that feedback and use it to revise the document. Make sure that you're using a friendly word choice, that you're respectful in your correspondence, and remember that being friendly doesn't mean writing the way that you speak, but it does mean avoiding that sort of stuffy language that some people think is necessary in business writing. Write in a clear, direct tone. Use words that are concise, that are accurate, but don't use things like "as per your request." Nobody really talks like that. Nobody really writes like that except for people who think that that's part of business communication. Never ever use sarcasm. Not only is it unprofessional, but sarcasm just doesn't work in writing very well. Sorry, you guys, I forgot to switch the slide. It requires body language to help people understand the message. It requires the ability to give instant feedback or to explain what you meant, and that's just not possible in text. Don't be demanding. Remember that any request that you make is basically a request for a favor. You're asking someone else to do something for you, and bossing them around doesn't work. I mean, it doesn't work with kids. Why would it work with adults? So be polite and make the request as easy as you can. People are usually willing to spend a few minutes of time helping you out if it seems easy for them to do. Remember that you should stay positive no matter how bad the news should be. If you're writing something that's very sensitive or it's likely to anger the reader, or if you're frustrated with the person you're responding to, have a cooling off session before you go back and do that revision. And then finally, remember to use the you viewpoint and focus on your reader's needs and feelings. When you finish the draft, print it out and pull out your highlighter. How many times did you use the first person pronoun I, me, my, we, us, or our? And how many times did you use the second person pronoun you or your? If the first outweighs the second, then figure out how many of the statements that use the first person could be rewritten to focus on the reader rather than yourself. So for example, if I'm writing a message to get people to fill out overtime request forms because I've got really bad response rates, then writing I need you to fill out the form so that I can process your request isn't likely to get a good response from the readers because it doesn't seem like there's anything in it for them. Instead, use the you focus. Please fill out the overtime request form so that the overtime reimbursement can be included on your next paycheck. There's clearly a benefit in it for the reader, and they're more likely to do what you're asking them to do. In terms of typical or routine correspondence, an inquiry is just a request for information. So this usually uses a direct pattern of organization, and make the request as specific as possible so that the reader can look for the right information or make the decision quickly. Those emails that we looked at asking permission to add to my class, well, those were inquiries, and the ones that you liked best were polite, respectful, and included relevant details without belaboring the point. A response is just a reply to an inquiry. It's a good idea to begin the response with a brief, just a sentence or two, summary of the situation before giving your answer so that you can refresh the reader's memory and make sure that you are stating the purpose and scope of your response. Complaints notify someone about a bad service, a defective product, or some sort of other bad experience, and then request a solution. Be polite and be calm. include relevant details, and make sure that you are specific in what's going to make you happy, what's going to satisfy your complaint. Companies have an interest in making sure that you are happy with the product or the service that they're offering. Word of mouth is really expensive. So they want to make sure that you're telling people that you're happy with their service rather than telling everyone to stay away. When you get a complaint, you're going to write either an adjustment, which solves the problem or offers an alternative, or you're going to write a refusal. If you have to write a refusal, turn down the request politely, but be firm about it. Don't make them guess at your intention. Use that indirect pattern to organize your information. And again, try to explain the reasoning first so that the reader feels like they've been heard. You might have heard some advice to avoid apologizing when you're responding to a complaint. That's really just bad advice. The idea was that apologizing was an admission of liability. But now most communication experts and even lawyers admit that an apology usually cools off the situation, makes the reader feel better, even if there's very little that you can actually do to solve the problem. So if someone is writing a complaint and your company is at fault, apologize and make it a real apology, not one of those "I'm sorry you feel that way" non-apologies. Now, a final type of typical correspondence is a collection letter, and I have to admit that I've never written one of these because I've never been in the type of organization that would have to write them. I've worked for larger organizations that had legal departments, and they were the ones who, I assume, took care of any sort of collections. Or I've worked for retail businesses where people weren't taking things on credit. But a collection letter simply asks a reader to pay an overdue bill. Don't assume that the recipient's a deadbeat or a lazy person. Particularly in this economy, there's a really good chance that the person's just a little low on money and needs a little extra time. But remember that your business needs money too in order to pay its own bills and its payroll. So the job of collection letter is to politely but firmly remind the reader of the outstanding debt and clearly state the conditions for repayment. Your goal is to get the reader to pay what's due and to be willing to continue doing business with your organization, or at least not badmouth your organization to others. So I want to briefly tell you about a situation in which I gave a complaint lately. I was making a purchase at Sam's Club here in town using a department credit card, and I was concerned that I'd have some problems when I went to the cashier at the end, so I checked with the customer service rep, and she assured me there'd be no problem. At the end of my shopping experience, about 2 hours later, I had $300 and 2 baskets worth of supplies for the department picnic. I get to the register, and I'm told, sure enough, there's a problem with the credit card, that the credit card for a state agency can't be used to pay for items that are taxable. And in Minnesota, that meant that I could only pay for the food, but not things like the plates and the napkins and so on. So I had to go home, drop off the food, pick up my personal checkbook, go back to Sam's, and buy the rest of the materials. So before I left, I made sure that I talked to the manager on duty. I didn't have the name of the person at the customer service desk, but I did point out that I was there at 9 o'clock in the morning, that I spoke with the young lady. I explained the situation. She told me that there wouldn't be a problem, and there was. He apologized. He told me that she was new and she was still being trained. That gave me an idea for the adjustment. So I simply asked to please make sure that she was finished training, and before she was finished training, not to leave her alone at the customer service desk, because she is the face of the organization and she's the one that people go to with questions and problems. He assured me that she would, and he also gave me a $15 gift certificate to Sam's Club for my troubles. So I made the complaint. I clearly stated what I would like, what would make me happy. I wasn't asking for a freebie or anything like that, but he gave me an adjustment to make me happy, and here I am telling you about the great service that I got at Sam's Club, even after I had a problem at Sam's Club. So a complaint doesn't have to be a big problem. It can be an opportunity for building a relationship with your customers. So this concludes the podcast about routine correspondence. If you have any questions, please let me know.